before we start the conversation, I thought it's good for me to mention that both Chandran and I are Malayalis. Chandran is a Malaysian Malayali. He was born and brought up in Malaysia. And the reason I'm saying that is he understands Malayalam, but he's not fluent in expressing in Malayalam. I wanted to share this because I didn't want anyone here to think it is odd that there are two Malayalis on stage, but discussing in English. And that is why I thought it's good for us to start with that. I myself grew up in Kozhikode. Chandran and I work together now in Hong Kong, and we are both part of the Global Institute for Tomorrow ecosystem. And so today, it's not so much about poetry. We are just going to have a discussion on two important themes, but we may also talk about other related themes. And if you have not read Chandran's books, I would urge you to do so, because Chandran is one of the most original thinkers coming out of Asia with a very strong interdisciplinary flavor. He talks about all the issues that we face in our current times in terms of geopolitics and crisis on climate, and brings it all together in a very original, compelling fashion. So in that context, there are two books we thought we will focus on. One is Consumptionomics. And just to make it very simple, Consumptionomics expands a little bit around what happens if everybody consumes too much. And I'm going to let Chandran explain the basic premise of the book in a minute. And the second book is Dismantling Global White Privilege. I think the title says it all. It's all about how do you bring down the dominance of a Western-centric view. And then he has written another book called The Sustainable State, all of which are very influential books. So maybe we can start. And I call him Chandran Cheta, so I'm going to, through the conversation, do that because that comes very naturally to me. I know it's not something he's used to, but maybe we can start by perhaps you telling a little bit about the premise of these books in your own words, and then maybe we can take it from there.
Okay, can you all hear me? Yes. So sorry, my Malayalam is no good. But if I stay here for 3 weeks, then it starts to come. When I first, Ajay invited me to come here, I'm going to call you bro, okay? When Ajay first invited me, he said there will be 5,000 people coming to listen to me. But then I've known for a long time, if you write serious books, nobody wants to listen. So thank you all for coming. But if you write a book like Michelle Obama's How to Grow a Garden with Lettuce in the White House, you'll sell 1 million books. So rubbish sells, but serious content doesn't sell. But I've got used to it, so thank you all so much for coming. I'm actually not a writer or poet like all of the distinguished people here, but I have ideas, inconvenient ones, and so I decided to write my first book about 12 years ago. And to your question, I spent most of my professional life looking at where we were headed for the last 35 years, mainly in consulting, looking at mainly the trajectory of human population increase, the convergence of the existential threats, the governance systems we have, and the economics. So I did a lot of consulting, but I came to the conclusion that the economic model that we all subscribe to is essentially one that is at war with people and the planet. It's essentially every problem we face today is essentially one of economic actors acting badly. Yeah? And I can break it down. So having been someone who started to look at climate change 30 years ago, before it became the fashion of the last 5-6 years, and did studies on this, I was beginning to see a disconnect between the narrative in the West that said this is a very big issue, we have to deal with it because it's very fashionable. Everybody wants to say the environmental issue is big, especially all the young people. They all want to say, oh my God, I want to save the world. But if you ask them to do something, and the doing is very difficult, a change, that is very difficult at a societal level. So I noticed that everyone spoke about these things, but at the same time, nobody wanted to change the economic model. And if I asked you to mention who are the world's leading thinkers on these issues of sustainability and environment, etc., the names that would come to your mind, apart from a few maybe local Indians you know, would be all Westerners. That 18-year-old girl from Sweden or something like that. Those narratives are actually very narrow. So I, coming from a science background, decided that I should actually confront the systemic issue, and which is, and I'll keep the response short as an introduction, which is that we are on a trajectory to essentially consume the earth. It is not driven by greedy people like you and me eating too much, but we are, but actually by an economic model which survives on only one thing: getting to you to buy things you don't need with money you don't have. It's called credit. That's an American invention. Any Americans here? Yeah, there's always one at least. Hi. But you know what I mean, right? Getting you to buy things you don't need with money you don't have. And then if you're middle class, getting you to buy things you don't need, getting you to buy things you don't need, but to impress people you don't like. Yeah? So it's always this. And that's the economic model. But to do things like that, to get you to buy things, you know, to go to the supermarket and buy one and get one free. You all know that? What is that? That is simply underpricing everything. But when you underprice consumption, there's a concept of externalities. Something is essentially, the true cost is being hidden. So I wanted to essentially say that the challenge that we as human race face is the economic model which is premised on a zero-sum game. You have to consume more, buy things you don't need, seduce you with now the internet, click and you'll get something, and then essentially to throw away things. And so the argument was that everything we consume is underpriced. Now I'll just finish please buy the book, it's called Consumptionomics. But the point I'm trying to make was this in the book, and it was the first book written about this idea of consumption and pricing. It's an economic and political model. But to simplify, the world's population will be 10 billion in about 30 years. 30 years, about 10 billion people. Asia will have 6 billion. 6 billion. India will be the most populated country in the world. And the idea that 6 billion Asians should aspire to live like lifestyles of the Americans and the Europeans, it's an absolute lie. It's against all the laws of physics, entropy, and all of that. So we have to reject that. That is a rejection both of the economic model, which nobody wants to think about, or difficult, and the political system. And the political system, which basically says that the individual is king, and the collective is just part of all the individuals. So I will stop by saying, I argued in my book that freedom is not unfettered, and in the crowded parts of our world, consumption has to be curtailed when it's overpriced, when it's underpriced, so that the disenfranchised can have access to things. And then I got asked by many people, What do you mean? How are you going to do it? And this is where I will become a bit controversial. I said the only way you can do it is tough rules. And tough rules are not made by Nike, Apple, or Hindustan Motors. Tough rules is made by the state. Tough rules that say, you, Chandran, cannot have 2 cars. Now, if I go to the United States and say that cars are not a human right, they think I'm undercover Taliban. Or maybe I'm from the Chinese Communist Party. But if you all have been to our cities in Asia, and this city is not so bad, but our cities, most of them are a mess. I'm sorry. We need more cars in our cities like I need a hole in my head. But some of you might say I need a hole in my head. But so who will say you can't have 2 cars? Well, in some countries they do it. There's a small place called Singapore where they say, okay, you go and have a car, but we will tax you. So I think what I mean is mobility is a right, private mobility is a luxury. So private mobility has to be curtailed because the externalities of everyone having private mobility is so extensive. So climate change is just the tip of the iceberg of our consumption-driven economy. And I can go on just looking at plastic waste all over India. I can go on about water, soil, everything. So that's the point, that we in this part of the world have to reject the economic and political model of the West. This is why I'm controversial. That doesn't mean I don't like white people. Please don't misunderstand me. It's not anti-Western. It's a non-Western thinking because we are living through a very specific time of human history where human populations are the exponential rate of growth. Everyone can't have everything. But that's the American dream that they exported to all of us. We can't. So then the question is, what can you have? And that I can talk about much longer. But I hope that gives a sense of what I mean by curbing consumption and pricing things so that the externalities don't destroy our societies.
Thank you. A lot of the work that we do together and the Global Institute for Tomorrow we do is trying to help businesses or societies or communities to operationalize some of the things that Chandran just mentioned. And there is a lot that you unpacked as you explained some of these forces at work, starting from the way the economic system is engineered and also a certain Western-centric thinking which all of us seem to have internalized due to historical forces and because of the fact that the world at the moment is skewed through a lot of the post-World War II dynamics, some of which you mentioned in your book, Dismantling Global White Privilege. I had 2 other things I was very curious to pick your brains on. One was, to what extent does all of this involve in some ways reforming capitalism as we know it, and what would your thoughts be around that? And second thing is, since you mentioned India, and since we are in India, I was curious to hear from a social engineering or from a point of view of how do we organize society and make a lot of things scalable, if you had any thoughts around it. So both capitalism as well as organizing, as an example, India, but it could be Indonesia or any other country.
Yeah. So I don't like to use these words, capitalism, socialism, and communism. These were all Cold War terms designed by essentially Western ideologues. That we are capitalists, we are good, this is how trickle-down economics work. And they create an extensive narrative around this. They built business schools, and all the bright Indians went there, and they all became the stormtroopers, and then they worked for Goldman Sachs. They never came back to India. You know this. So I don't like to talk about it this way. I like to talk about it from the point of view of what is a government and economy for? The state's role is to harness the capital, the human capital and other resources of the jurisdiction or the sovereign state that they have responsibility for, to essentially provide 2 or 3 things. But I will limit it to one thing, and that is to build an economy. But what is the economy for? And I put it in very simple terms. The state's role is to create an economy that functions in a way that ensures that the majority of people do not suffer from the drudgery of life. What do I mean by the drudgery of life? Some of us have escaped it for so long, we have no clue what the drudgery of life looks like. But some of you will know, especially I think people in India will know. But I would also dare say that middle-class Indians, I've said this many times, have been desensitized to the drudgery of life of the majority of their fellow citizens. I get into trouble for this, but who cares? So they've been desensitized to the drudgery. But what is the drudgery of life? And I have 5 principal things that I think the obligation of the state to organize the resources and the economy to provide. The first is food, safe and secure. Food, safe and secure. That in itself is going to be a huge challenge, especially for a country like India. Right? Second is water and sanitation. That's a fundamental human right. But today, if you go around and you speak to politicians, and I do, and you go to conferences, if you ask someone what's the most important technology, almost like robots, they will say something to do with AI, big data, and all of this. And I said, what world do you live in? The most important post-pandemic, the most important technology going forward is a toilet and a water supply system. And actually, my only claim to fame in India was 15 years ago. I spoke at the India Conclave, and I was in the opening keynote debate, and I said that India should put toilets before temples. Somewhere in the transcript of India Today, I was the first person who coined it. And then I think there were a couple of ministers, and then it went on. I don't want to stake claim to it, but it's there. I was a rock star for about 2 days because I said, looking like me, I said, no more temples. And we should create temples that are wastewater plants, because the rivers are our gods, and we have desecrated them with pollution. And each wastewater plant, multi-billion dollars, we should call them the Lord Brahma, Shiva, Vishnu, and all of that. And we'd have a statue which is 6 inches. If you want it in gold, you can get some rich people to donate. But everyone liked it so much. But the third day, all the Bollywood people came, and everyone forgot about toilets and development, and no one was talking to me anymore after that. So water and sanitation, I know much progress has been made here. But I was in Cochin the other day, expecting post-COVID, my first trip after 5 years, and I was shocked. There was no progress. So then the next thing the governments have to do is, of course, provide what I call housing. And you all know the issues, basic housing. Then it's public health, access, then education. When I speak about this in a Western audience, they will say, my God, you didn't say freedom of speech. I say, who cares? Give me food first. Give me shelter. Give me safety. Give me security. Give me the right to essentially be mobile so that I can live a life with dignity and without the daily drudgery of life, and which includes some energy. So that's what I think so which means you go around it, who cares? And I think one of the countries that, as a small example, amplified that was Singapore. I know we got someone from Singapore. Lee Kuan Yew was not interested in listening to dissent. He had an objective. Today, Singapore is one of the most admired. And then I'll say something that I hope Indians will not take exception to. China. China has basically delivered on those 5 things for more than 95% of its population. And that's the obligation. So You can call the Chinese system capitalism, socialism, whatever. But the thing we are interested in is the outcome. And the outcome is the dignity of the people's lives and allowing them to lead lives that allow them to be, potential. Now, your second question was about the... Yeah, so for me, the engineering India issue, I come to India a lot. I come to Kerala. Of course, I went to the temple yesterday. It's just amazing. But I can't understand why India can't organize. And I think that's something to do with the state of governance. And I'll be even more controversial and say that in its current state, for large nations, which is in this book, I think there's a real dilemma. In the 21st century, with all the existential threats, and the assault of an economic model which is essentially driven by consumption and therefore pollution, you all know the plastic problem is out of control. Just this week, I think Nature published a paper saying that now microplastics are found in human brains. This is Nestle, this is all of these companies, and they are still in denial. So I think governments need to really start to act forcefully. The problem is, in a messy multi-democracy, can you do that? I think it's difficult. So I won't say which system is better, but if you want to put a collective and you want to address these fundamental large-scale problems where people are being poisoned daily, and the microplastics, even someone like me who follows the science, I was shocked that microplastics are found in human reproductive systems already. This is about 6 months ago, there was a paper. But to find microplastics in human brains, it is essentially a wake-up. But you can't do it by having a messy, you're going to have what I call tough rules. Now the question is, which governance system allows you? So I also don't like to prescribe to democracy or capital or authoritarian states. I think these are all facades of ideological obsessions. Outcomes matter, and then the people's rights to a decent life, away from poisoning and freedom of, not freedom of expression, but freedom from drudgery is the most important thing.
Thank you. I will, before I ask the next question, I will just pause in case anybody in the audience has a compelling need to ask a question. You can raise your hand. Yes.
Sir, I am Shankar. I am an investor in stock market for the 35 years. Sir, I see a trend in 1930, 35, 1970 to 1980, and 1999 to present. All this period are crisis period. The particularity of this period is from baby boomers to we are aging population, now facing aging population. This money printing and artificially boosting the economy is not belongs to capitalism. This is part of socialism. I think this is part of socialism to postpone the crisis. So I think this is a natural process. The consumption economy will automatically fade out. And this new way of life of I own nothing, I am happy, I own nothing. I don't want a car because it's always available. I don't need a house because I am always traveling. This type of new ideology may come in the future. What's your thought about the same? Thank you.
Thank you. Very quickly, printing money, I won't define it as socialism or capitalism, but you said it's socialism. Well, the country that prints the most amount of money is the USA. And I think they claim to be strongly capitalist. And if you said to the Americans that they were socialists, they would say no. My view is, and with all due respect, the stock market as we know today is a Ponzi scheme. Last week, 2 weeks ago, when DeepSeek was released, I think NVIDIA lost 50 billion. I mean, what is this? 50 billion? So this is all a Ponzi scheme, and it's just a handful of people, etc. Some of us on the peripheries putting our savings inside, but this is part of the problem. So the other point you said that soon everybody will not want a car and all of this. I think, again, with all due respect, the majority of people don't have proper homes. I did a project in India about 8-9 years ago. And for those of you who haven't, the majority of people live in substandard homes. And the amount of people who will live in substandard homes across the Asia Pacific will simply increase. Why? Land is less, extreme weather is more, and habitable places are becoming less and less. So before we talk about the privileged few of us, and by the way, most people don't travel. You know, there's some data that says that something like more than 60% or 70% of all human beings have never traveled more than 50 kilometers from their homes. So if you go to Orissa, most people have never traveled, or you go to Assam and all of that. So I think these sort of very liberal ideas written by Western economists is just nonsense. I lived in Africa, etc. So the question is, in the next 30 years or 50 years, how do we provide at the state people with the basic needs? Water supply, I'm a water engineer, water supply and sanitation is going to become a huge issue, both economic as well as from an engineering task, right? So if you've been to Mumbai, the 25 million people, most wastewater in the world is not treated. Today there's 8 billion people. So people like me, when I live in Hong Kong and all of that, but fortunately I come from a wastewater background. I was building pit latrines in Africa. You can take a flush toilet as it came with God. That's how the world is. But actually, it's a luxury. Most people don't have. So 80%, even if you have a flush toilet, where is it going? So if you go around India, sadly, it goes into open waters, treatment plants. So these things will require basic needs to be met. The idea that the idea that some people will give up their cars, I think is 50 years ahead. But if the state starts to intervene, then it's different. And I have argued that car ownership is not a human right, right? So then we say about mobility is a human right. So I never owned a car in my life, but fortunately I've lived in the cities where public transport was first class. So in Hong Kong, I can go for 6 meetings a day and never be late, right? Because the public transport is good. So that's where the investment is. So I would argue, I would just respond to you by saying the majority of people are not like you and me, privileged. I'm very privileged. And they don't have the option of, oh, I don't need a car or this or that. But don't forget, the aspiration is, I must get a car. It's called the advertising industry, right? So that's the aspiration, buy things you don't need. Whereas if the governments, even bottled water and all of these things, I think governments should put a huge tax on bottled water and essentially then convert that tax into public water supply systems. There are many things we can do.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one or two perspectives and just build on what Chandran Nair mentioned. And I like to also look at what drives our behavior and what drives our motivation. And that's a lens which I usually have used in my career. And we have someone like Dr. Joe Lloydso here who understands the human brain far better than I do. The problem is for consumption to reduce, it requires millions and billions of individuals to change the way we act and the way we consume and the way our brains respond to stimuli. And all research and all evidence suggests that we are very vulnerable to being manipulated by these very large forces that want us to consume more and more, in whichever system it may be. So we are primed to be greedy in some sense, and we are primed to not be aware. And I think we are notoriously poor in understanding what makes us happy. I mean, there is a lot of research which suggests that we chase the wrong things, one of which it is more consumption. And therefore, I'm not very sure, without some kind of an intervention and some kind of a opposing force that counters the general drift of how we are moving, that consumption as we know it would fade away naturally. But who knows? Okay, these are all views that all of us have. Maybe I'll pause again and wait and see if anybody has a question. I think we have 3 people. I think the gentleman there raised his hand first, and then it's Alvin, and then the person there, or whichever order, doesn't matter. I think we have time for all 3.
You clearly said the various issues faced by India, the various issues. And we know that we are living in a messy political era, and no government is going to go after this. So I think the only way to have a solution is to have an individual change. So what is your advice to a common Indian citizen to walk the talk so that at least after 30 or 50 years we can achieve these things?
I'm not a great believer that people will behave properly. If you look at human civilization, humans have had to be curtailed and join the temple, the church, so that there are rules, because we don't know. But if you are very poor, struggling, then the rules become tough to abide by, because you're struggling for the minimum. If you're a farmer, all of these shortcuts, cheating, all of these things begin to happen. People use all kinds of chemicals to improve their yields, etc. So talking about the average citizen, of course you want to get to that, but get to that level that the consciousness comes about. But before you get to that level, the basic needs of the majority must be fulfilled. And that can only be done by the state. So if you are to say, provide water for 200 million people in UP, the population, that cannot be done by individuals. That is the onus of the state, because the state is supposed to have the mechanisms by which it can mobilize and put that in place. Low-cost housing is, if I'm poor, I need the state to help me. So I think the middle class in us tends to think, oh, I will be a good citizen, I'll turn on the lights, etc. But when no one's watching, I will behave like a bandit. Just look at how we operate when we go on holiday. So my argument is, maybe some individuals, but you're going to need very tough rules, because humans are prone to bad behavior until they reach a different stage. So if I look at Singapore again, when Lee Kuan Yew came about first, and he said, no chewing gum, and if you litter, I'll fine you, and if you smoke, I'll fine you, all of us thought, crazy Chinese guy. What's wrong with him? He's a communist. But today, I think most Singaporeans have reached a level, they don't even need to think about, I don't throw that. This is their behavior. Then the government can go to another level of understanding. So for the large countries, I think you have to provide those basic needs so people are not suffering on the edge of poverty. Again, I will say that I think China did this over the last 30 years. So next stage is, how do they provide people with the other rights that they will want, but they are no more suffering from no electricity. The toilets, when I first went to China 35 years ago, 10 people sitting on the same. Today, the toilets post-COVID, it's like Star Trek. And I'm not talking about Shanghai or Beijing. I'm talking about small towns. So they went to that level. Now the question will be, what are the people's expectations? But the indignity, the terrible poverty is eradicated. And that was only done by the heavy hand of the state. No discussion. I always give the thing, China's built mass mobility with the high-speed railways. So if they want to build a high-speed rail from Beijing to another place, and it's 1,000 kilometers, and the economic benefits is for 100 million people, but they have to move 100,000 people. There's no discussion. It's very clear. 100 million people will benefit. The train has to go this way. We have to move 100,000. We will move them. But please, let's go to the Supreme Court. There is no Supreme Court. I'm just giving you very stark examples of that. The individual, yes, but you can't rely on the individual. They behave badly.
I think we had Alvin and the gentleman in the fifth row. Yes.
I very much agree with your identification of the problem, but I was wondering, sir, you talked about implementing tough rules by the state, right? But I was wondering how this would work in an increasingly competitive environment where the world drives around development and profit maximization. To further elaborate, without an integrated framework, like all countries adopting the same policy, if a single country adopts like this, implementation of tough rules, as you spoke, and India, who is in dire need of development, would be pushed backward by those multinational companies, and they would search other viable options that would deprive us of the development we need. So I would like your opinion about this.
Just very quickly, multinationals are very powerful, but a lot of what multinationals do, you don't need. So what I'm trying to say here is that I'm not saying we will live in a perfect world. There is no capitalism, greed. I mean, it's the human condition. But you have to deal with the realities of what you can control, and the state has an obligation to provide people with a dignity of life. And then you have to deal with other things. You'll remember that the 5 things I said, these are not things that multinationals do. These are public goods, right? So low-cost housing is not a multinational business. Low-cost housing, Apple doesn't do it, or all of those. These are public goods done by the state. So I've argued, for instance, the idea, the old trickle-down economics of the past was that, I will get educated. I will then go and work for some multinational like Walmart. And my God, we need Walmart to come to India because it creates jobs for a handful of people. But this is good, apparently. And then I will save a few rupees every day, every month. I'll put it in HSBC or whichever bank, and then I'll get a mortgage. This will not solve the housing problem. The housing problem is a social good, and it can be done. Again, I don't want to give Singapore too much face here, but they did it. All right? In India, I would argue that India could actually build housing for everyone. It's got the engineers. Of course, quality has to improve. It's got the engineers, it's got the planners, and do it without any multinational, any foreign direct investment. It could be rupee bonds. Just print a lot of rupees and build homes for everyone. And then you can get all the financial geniuses in India to work out how that value is on the books, right? And in the national assets. So there are many other ways to do it. But I will always come back to, you have, in the crowded world we live in, we are in the most crowded period of human history. After 2060, the world's population will decline or peak. And it might catastrophically peak because of all the problems we have, or it may start to steady. But population is declining, but we are still on the steep edge. So we have to navigate the next 30 years. So you can't tell a poor people, you just wait. We have an obligation to do that. So that's what I would say, that first, basic needs, the state has to do that. It's not multinationals, it's not about capitalism, it's about the social obligation of the state to provide the basic public and common goods.
$36 trillion debt. America is socialism. That's why created $36 trillion debt. But China is centralized capitalism. I think China is the only country in the with capitalism to my knowledge. That's why without any other countries, China survived. To give question, sir. I think it's true. Please explain.
Next question.
I think you've hit the nail on the head in terms of the way in which we've organized the world today that privileges what we call capitalism or what we call the market economy as almost a religion, right? Almost an inevitable way in which human beings are supposed to progress, as if we either have development or we have nothing, which is, you hear this over and over again. But the fact is, if you look into history, we know that the wealth of the West today comes in large part because they basically took from other countries, right? It's not actually sustainable. They had cheap labor from our countries. We built, Asians built their railways. They took wealth from South America, Asia, Africa. They continue to do so. So in fact, it isn't actually capitalism that built their wealth. It's colonialism, it's imperialism, it's pillage of a different kind. If we were to aspire to their level of so-called development using their methods, we will fail unless we are prepared to do what they did for a few hundred years, which is to go to war and steal. Related to that is the question of why countries like little Singapore, you could argue Japan, you could argue Vietnam, you could argue China, have governments that have decided to go a different way, which is admirable. One argument I would argue was war, the deprivations of war. Because we know left to their own devices, businessmen and governments and the privileged will want to do whatever they can to maintain their privilege even if the rest suffer. It's a question of bad faith. I think they know perfectly well that this is not working, but it works for them. So my question then is, how do we incentivize the state to put in the right kinds of regulation and tough rules of their own accord that will put things right? How do we put in those incentives? How do we get people to get the state to do the right thing for the rest of us?
Thank you. So, the stuff you mentioned at the outset is essentially my last book. It's called Dismantling Global White Privilege. Not many people read it because white people look at this and say, I'm not buying this. So it's not on the New York bestsellers list. So I'm hoping Penguin India will print it, but this is the only book in the world that outlines what you have described. If you Google white privilege, you get the very shallow discussions in the US around black men being harassed by police or white women shouting, oh my God, there's a black man here. But if you Google global white privilege, nothing comes up. Because even universities and white liberals dare not write this book. But I wrote this book, and it essentially talks about what you said about the history. That colonial history was one, and everyone gets bored a bit talking about colonialism, but because they think that was in the past. But it's actually active and alive today. What is Gaza? What is the genocide in Gaza? It's white privilege at its best in the 21st century. Israel, US, and a few European allies, essentially preserving the might of white colonial settlers. Israel is the last existing and operating white colonial settlers. No one disagrees that Jewish people and Israelis have a right, but they have no right to commit genocide. Why is the USA protecting it? Why is Great Britain? Why are the Germans? It's the tribe, because the world is changing. So the plunder is over, and they're so afraid. So we understand, as you said, that we can't go on like this. This is why I say India will, I live in Hong Kong, so I've seen the attempt by the CIA to dismantle Hong Kong and all that. 95% to my Indian friends, I will say, 95% of everything you read about China is a lie. I swear to God, because most of it is distorted, because there's a huge political agenda to preserve the old order of plunder. But most Indians, and me included, for a long time in my life, I was subservient because I was taught Shakespeare. It's got no meaning in my life in tropical monsoon Malaysia, and I was reading about meadows and castles and thinking, what the hell is this? Okay, so we are all captive in our mind. Even I talk about my book. We were talking about breakfast. That one of the largest, widest selling products in India is skin whiteness. It's shameful what's happened. But to the economics of it, this book goes in to say, how do you do this? We have to disassociate ourselves from the iron grip of the current capitalist system. So if you look at the current global capitalist system, essentially all the institutions and the gatekeepers are Western. Rating agencies are Western. If you want to do an M&A deal, you have to go to one of those Western lawyers. You can't go to Ali, Wong, and Krishna. Or you can't go to Krishna, Murthy, and Narayanan. Apparently only Ernst & Young, nomads. Japanese can't do this. So there's only like 5 or 6. So everything is that. I mean, I've been in business a long time. Rating agencies, and there's a chapter on this. So the grip is that we have to dissociate. That doesn't mean we are looking to fight the West. But you have to understand the Western world is only 15%. And the Western world's most powerful actor at the moment is the United States. I think Europe understands, but it doesn't want to give up the power, so it hangs on to the Yanks. But the Yanks will go down fighting. And the only country that's able to resist the West today is China. The Japanese couldn't. And that's why China is public enemy number 1. And I can tell you the Chinese will not invade Taiwan. Because the Western mentality of conquest and all of that is that others will behave like us. They don't understand. Other civilizations have been through war, etc., but they don't have the same track record. The Chinese have been all over the world for centuries. I'm not saying they didn't do bad, but they never went and essentially took over in this sense. So to your point, how do we incentivize? I think governments, when elected, need to be incentivized. But we have been so seduced by the idea of democracy that we think we must oppose the government. And I always say to people, work with your government. No matter how bad they are, work with them first. Because if you don't, there'll be willing partners from outside giving you money to try and destabilize your government. That's the copybook of the Western Alliance led by the CIA. I saw this in Hong Kong myself, all over the world. So even if your government is weak, not good enough, well, you don't need Western help to make it better because they have no interest in making it better. And if you believe that, you are basically subservient, you don't understand. So I urge all Asians and all to go and work. And when I speak to Asians, Africans, Arabs in Europe and the United States, I say, what are you doing here? You should go home. You're privileged, you're well educated, you should go home and help. But the capture of the mind has got us, many of us Asians, thinking, if I go to London, then that's cool. I'll be better off than my people, right? So to your point, we should work with them, even they're imperfect, make them better, but don't try and start revolutions and fight because the NED or the CIA and all funded you, and you want to be famous on Time magazine as the Asian who stood up against an oppressive regime. Work with them, build capabilities, but I will also say there is no substitute for good leaders, and you are blessed with a good leader. I'll give one example, Japan. Japan has economic leaders, but they never had charismatic leaders. Even my Japanese friends can't remember the last 5 prime ministers. They don't know. But Japan is unique. It's a society in which the commitment to the collective is much stronger than me, the individual. So then it works. The Koreans have a bit of the same, right? But those are outliers in terms of the ability of a society to operate in the way that incentivizes everyone to work for the greater good. So that's why if you take a train in Tokyo and you go to the toilet, you can eat off the floor. It's that clean. Because the Japanese idea is of the social contract. Now we want to get there, it's not easy, but there's no substitute for strong leadership, and then the public understanding they have to build the social contract. But that takes a period of time for the society to transform. You have to essentially, if I can put it this way, beat people into shape. This is what Lee Kuan Yew did. And this is what China did. Chinese trains 25 years ago were a complete mess. Today, Chinese trains are as good as the Japanese. Not in terms of the technology, but in terms of the behavior of the average Chinese, who 10 years ago would eat the chicken bone and throw it away. Those of us who are from no Chinese culture, they would do it. Today, no more. How did they do it? They beat people into shape. Not by taking away human rights, but by incessantly telling them to be proud. And then it changed the behavior. So, long answer, but a great question. I think it takes commitment to believe. And stop believing that those guys are going to come and help you because they have no history. I mean, I always say to my Indian friends, Western friends, the Brits didn't come to India because they like Indian people, or chicken tikka, they like it now, or masala chai. They came here to plunder. They left a few things you can argue, but Shashi Tharoor wrote a great book to show all of this. But now we have to be independent and decide on which form of governance. Anyway, I can go on, but great question. Thank you.
Maybe we have time for one more question and then we wind up.
How we can critically examine and challenge the contemporary manifestation of colonial power with the structure and the attitude. So that is my question. Could you please
Read this book. Yes. As a starting point.
Yeah. I would say read the book. You can also go look up.
There's a lot of literature
yes.
on this.
I think in the book Dismantling the White Privilege, you have portrayed something about the white people are not well aware about the white privilege. So what's the reason behind that? So they should know about that, the white privilege.
They don't. We were having a good discussion with your friend. It's very difficult to accept that you have privileges that most people don't have. It's very difficult to come to terms with the fact that you have rights that other people don't have, especially when you have created a facade that you're the champions of equity, democracy, freedom, and liberty. It's very difficult. So it requires, and I think my friend there is much more qualified to talk about the human thing, but it's very difficult. My view is it'll only come with pain. And the pain is what we are feeling now. But the pain is not just the pain within Western societies, but it's the pain that as Western societies have to come to terms with the rest, they will inflict on others too. And this is pain. So this is one of the most painful periods in human history in the modern era, because we are coming to the end of that colonization era. What's going on in Gaza is the world woke up. These are the last guys. Whether you support Hamas or whatever this, but people are shocked by what they saw. I heard about the Holocaust, but I never saw it on TV. I never saw babies with legs cut off. And these people are saying it's okay. So I think this brutalization will result in a global consciousness that will dismantle this privilege. And I think we should be careful, but Westerners don't quite understand it yet. Even good friends of mine who are very liberal, who are authors. This is a bit hard. It's a bit hard to accept. I am privileged. And my book goes into the day-to-day life things that creates this. So it will take time and painful.
My name is Manfred Hall, and I come from Winnipeg, Canada. You mentioned the social contract, and it sounds like you think that the social contract needs renewing and strengthening in order for social society to survive. How do you see that the social contract can be strengthened so that we can have a better future?
I mean, I think depends what you mean by the social contract. But if we talk about the social contract, primarily, first social contract, I think, is the social contract that the economic actors need to have in society at large, because they can influence it in good ways or very bad ways, right? The social contract. So that needs to be essentially one that's why we have rules. Governments say the social contract is today certain chemicals cannot be produced anymore, this and that and all of that. Then second, but you need a social contract that is essentially free of interference from active economic players. And therefore the state has to be strong. If the state is captive, then it becomes weak. The United States today is a weak state. In fact, it's run by people who are essentially billionaires. I mean, I never thought we'd see a day where billionaires are running the United States, most of whom are clowns, most of whom you wouldn't have marry your daughter or your sister or whatever, right? So you wouldn't invite for dinner. So the social contract is really important. But the narcissism of our societies today, built around this idea we can consume everything, and technology is a major player in this digital technology, requires teachers and parents. So I wrote a piece, if any of you are interested, saying that called The Rise of the Mobile and the Collapse of Parenting. And I think parents have essentially outsourced upbringing of their kids to the mobile phone, and everything is assumed digital. So there's many levels at which the social contract has to happen. It's economic actors, the state not being subsumed by those economic actors, and then the social contract of parenting and people bringing up the next generation to understand. And I think that's an underestimated problem driven by the abuse of technology. I mean, one thing I'd say, I've asked for strong regulation of mobile phones. I said that anyone under 18 should not have a mobile phone. And I've been saying this for years, but last month, I think Singapore is putting some strict rules. But in Australia, they are going to put strict rules about phones for 16-year-olds cannot be used, etc. And I think they should be banned in classrooms, and those things are really important. So the social contract is also being eroded by technology, but you need all the actors to. In China, anyone under 18 cannot use certain mobile phones. I think our time's up, but there is no substitute for regulation to bring in the social cohesion we need, because we are living in a complex world. I come from Malaysia. Social cohesion in a multicultural society, I cannot go around expressing freedom of speech by insulting Muslims. That freedom I should not be entitled to. So all of these things are really important, and you have to have rules.